Indeed, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to cover this topic somewhat briefly, because to some extent it's still in its development sort of concept at this stage. So it really is an opening up with the stakeholders in terms of to get input, and can very much be influenced in terms of what it's going to translate to in terms of its final form. I don't know. Can I just go next slide, or who's controlling the slides? Next slide again. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so maybe before we get into discussing the sort of urgent union procedure that's been introduced with the new pharmacovigilance legislation, it's as well to review then what we have today in the toolkit of the regulator in the area of safety referrals. And as usual in Europe, and not just in Europe, everybody hides behind a sort of secret code in terms of describing procedures and how they're run. We make it complex with these very sort of indecipherable sort of references. But simply put, we have in terms of pharmacovig safety driven referrals, we've about 4 procedural legal basis for them. On the right hand side, underneath the bottom there, you have the so-called Article 20. And basically, if you have products authorized through the centralized system, with a European, pan-European authorization, they typically get handled, all safety issues get handled through these Article 20 procedures when it happens to be a product on its own. But indeed today, any quality problems, let's say you have a quality defect or indeed any sort of problem with a product, that would also be handled through the very same Article 20 procedure. And the concept is that this has a bit of a variable timeline. It can be done very rapidly, but equally it can take an awful long time, can be months, even best part of a year before you might have an outcome for some of these procedures. And then on the left-hand side, you have this multiplicity of articles that deal essentially with the other regulatory route system in Europe in terms of the nationally authorized routing systems. And you have a so-called Article 107, regulatory review procedure, safety referral procedure, and Article 31. And these deal with classically parallel national, quite well-established nationally authorized products. And the major difference between the 107 and the Article 31 is a question of speed, with the 107 being a sort of rapid type procedure, and the Article 31 being a sort of deeper procedure that you spend more time looking into the full risk-benefit assessments of various products or classes. And we also have the Article 36 today, which is a sort of unique procedure specifically for these group of nationally authorized products ever since 1995 that have ended up going through the mutual recognition or indeed the decentralized procedure since about 2005. And typically, again, if you do have safety problems with these type of products, or if you have quality problems, whatever, they're run through one or other of these articles at any given time. So what did the pharmacovig package, in terms of its review proposals, what did it do to this current toolkit that we have? So if we go on to the next one, please. Yeah, it looks on the, so no, back again. Sorry, there was a very subtle one there. Thank you. It looks like, in fact, that it didn't do very much superficially and at the surface level. That the Article 36, so that little procedure that was pretty much dreamt up of for mutual recognition and decentralized, those sort of linked products, that had been done away with, as it were. And the 107 procedure that we've had since about 2004-05 has now got a little I attached to it, and the 31 is still there, and the Article 20 is still there. But this is a very misleading sort of graphical representation of the change, because in reality, what lies behind the pharmacovig revision proposal is essentially to make the Article 107I the sort of route one with respect to looking at safety issues, handling urgent safety issues in Europe. And essentially all roads lead into this Article 107I as the sort of fast track and the primary review mechanism. And indeed then Article 31 and Article 20 will to some extent then be somewhat secondary type of procedures. So you'd expect to see a lot more 107s eyes into the future, and maybe to a lesser extent 31s and 20s. Okay, so next slide please. So what is this famous 107I in terms of its new form? Well, for the first time, and it's an important change, it covers not just the nationally authorized products, which it always has done to an extent, and also these, the 36 has gone away, so now it covers mutual recognition products and decentral products, but to some extent the old one did that as well. But very importantly, it now can also cover centrally authorized products. So basically, this is now an umbrella procedure, and it's a one size fits all to a point that where you have this collection of national mutual recognition and central products, they can all be dealt with because fundamentally, maybe the same active substance, the same safety concern in a given class is driving the concern, and that's what then has to be addressed through this particular procedure. In terms of who can kick off this type of procedure, it's important that there's a balance in the system here, and then basically it can be initiated either by a member state national competent authority or by the European Commission. And it is called the urgent union procedure because it's considered to be used preferably then when urgent action is considered necessary. And there's a number of criteria also given out in the detailed legislation that would sort of guide the system as to when that urgent action needs to be taken and when this procedure should be triggered. And we'll touch on that in a bit more detail. This is just a quick overview of the basic elements of the procedure. Very importantly, it establishes clear time limits, whereas before these limits were left somewhat open. And now there is a very specific 60 days that's been assigned to the future PRAC committee, the Pharmacovigilance Advisory Committee, and a further 30 days for the bodies that are then consuming the outcome that's coming from the PRAC, be it the CHMP when there's centrally authorized products involved, at least one centrally authorized product. And if there are no centrally authorized products involved, then it goes to the coordination group, the current CMDH that we have today. And they have 30 days then in terms of to get engaged with this 107 procedure. And I think it's obviously very important with respect to this particular stakeholder meeting. The consultation, this is a key change, has been opened up, whereas in the old system, all of the consultation was very much bilateral between the industry, the marketing authorization holders or potentially the applicants, very much with the regulators. And we had sort of fledgling attempts, which have over the years to open up review dialogue with healthcare professionals and patients associations, but to some extent it's been limited, and there's a lot of constraints on that. But here we have a piece of legislation that essentially opens up this particular procedure for the fast track safety procedure essentially wide open to the public, and indeed what's meant to be targeted is of course the healthcare professionals, the patients themselves, the marketing authorization holders, because of course they're fully engaged in the process. And that consultation involves written pretty much systematically, and that's the intent. And then plus or minus the public hearing, that's the may provision, so it's by no means systematic, but it's a may provision, and we have to see how over the years that may provision then is implemented by way of an evolutionary process. Next slide, please. In terms of an outcome from this procedure, again, it's the PRAC will within 60 days have to come up with some sort of outcome, positive, negative. That then goes to the CHMP opinion if there's a central product involved, and if not, then it'll go to the coordination group CMDH for agreement. And typically that'll then be followed by a commission decision when it's needed that makes that outcome binding, essentially affects into law. And of course those decisions can be addressed either to companies or the authorization holders, or indeed they can be addressed to member states, national competent authorities, depending on what needs to be done. And importantly as well, the outcomes can either concern temporary measures, because if something's breaking very quickly, you might want to take some sort of precautionary type of action even before you fully determine the issue. And then also final measures once the system has decided, how a given matter should ultimately be dealt with. And it's important to stress that because European procedures, there's sometimes an awful lot of pressure at the national level to take action once a given issue goes out into the public domain. And there is, of course, nothing in the system ever prevents an individual member state taking urgent action to protect public health, even before any sort of European level view is decided upon. And that's an important, I think, sort of counterbalancing sort of safeguard that allows a member state to take what they believe to be the appropriate action before any sort of consensus or majority view emerges at the European level. Thereafter, of course, they are then bound by whatever European outcome there is, because you cannot really sustain a divergent position. It wouldn't really be a very logical situation to be in. One feature that is going to be very much a challenge in this 107 is there is no rights of re-examination. There's plenty of other regulatory procedures like the classical licensing procedure, you know, that the CHMP is just meeting on one floor above, and you'll have a company asking for a license, and then if it's refused in the first round, there is a sort of a 4-month re-examination timeline process. But because it is an urgent union procedure, again, it's not thought that that should be delayed, you know, for technicalities or even for very, very, you know, robust and sincere motivation. The thing is that the system has to be able to react relatively quickly to deal with something that is considered to be urgent and of community concern. Next slide, please. So just going over these sort of various phases again in a little bit more detail. In terms of the initiation, the 107 then is reserved for pharmacovigilance activities, which covers a whole host of sort of different activities and data sources coming in. It is meant to be a data-driven system, so obviously we're always on the lookout for new data elements, new information, regardless of source, that then add to the knowledge of risk-benefit on any given medicinal product or class. And today in the legislation, there is this criteria of urgency. So and this is where the urgent union procedure, the name, and this is a total open issue. We had this in the recent meeting with the heads of agencies, and today ourselves, who's deciding this urgency. And knowing that the triggering parties then are the member state national competent authorities and the Commission, then you can imagine that there's at least at that level a desire that has to be some sort of consensus with respect to, you know, the trigger levels, the threshold levels to initiate these 107s. But I did refer to these criteria that are meant to give guidance as to the sorts of activities that might end up in these types of procedures. And I think you won't be surprised to see that list, which is suspension, revocation of a marketing authorization if an authority is considering or indeed does it, if they're prohibiting the supply of a product in any way, either in total prohibition or some sort of limitation of it, if they're refusing to renew a marketing authorization, let's say at a 5-year time point. Of course, if you have one authority refusing to renew something, then really the European system has got to react to that in some way. If you're introducing a new contraindication, and you know, if you understand the nuances between special precautions and warnings versus a contraindication is a situation where the system believes it has in its hands sufficient data that says it really is, you know, it's an incredibly bad thing to use this product in this way because, you know, harm is almost guaranteed to follow, and that isn't always the case where we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and grey areas. But obviously, if somebody believes they were looking at a new contraindication, that's a very important issue that needs to be dealt with rather quickly. Similarly, reduction in dose and restriction of indications with sort of safety drivers behind. And then largely these are things that the regulatory system can come from the companies, the industry, but often comes from the authorities then, you know, with the monitoring and review functions that they have. But there's also, if a company itself defines on safety concerns, interrupts placing a product on the market, or indeed decides to withdraw the marketing authorization, then indeed 107 should be initiated to deal with that, because sometimes that can be market by market specific withdrawals, and you know, you might have the same active substance in other member states, and it's a good thing then that the system looks into these things to then decide whether that action needs to be extrapolated out on a European level. And indeed, you know, to some extent, there might be a situation that a member state might feel, well, you know, my country's okay, the product's off in my market, I, you know, don't have any great concern or any need to motivate anything at the European level. And to some extent, then the European Commission can also complement that potential action from a member state in initiating this procedure, and that's also perhaps a useful addition to have, and it's vice versa when it comes to other procedures within the system. But I think that the real spirit is that knowing that the initiators are either the Commission or most typically, I believe, will be the member states, the idea is in a network system in Europe that there will have to be a collective approach to deciding the trigger point to initiate these referrals. Next slide, please. Another very important aspect of it, which is quite a unique feature vis-a-vis the more classical procedures that we've been used to at the European level for the last 15 years or so, is this idea that it will be public. So if a 107 is triggered, it will go into the public domain, and it's not just a sort of simple statement to say we're starting a procedure. It is actually then that the issue, the questions that are being raised on a given product, as well as a member state assessment report that is motivating them to make this referral, they will be made public. And the idea then is that there will be a time limit identified whereby the public, in its widest definition, can submit data relevant to the matter in hand. And to some extent then, we are not so sure, and this is a totally open area of discussion in terms of how are we going to deal with the variety of data sources that may come in to, in response to such a call. And we understand that a level of triage will have to be applied to that in terms of, even as a classification exercise, to understand what you're dealing with. Is it clinical trials, publications, case reports, whatever? But this is the idea that there's this public announcement of the start of the procedure, a call for data to be submitted, and open to all of the various stakeholders to make such a submission. And again, very early days in terms of people thinking about the process, but it would also be at this stage whether, if there was going to be a public hearing in the context of a 107, then this would be announced at this stage then, and the timing of that would be announced in advance. Next slide, please. So we mentioned before that the clock is very fixed in these urgent union procedures, 60 days for the PRAC with no clock stop, because there is none foreseen in the legislation, and that's followed by a sort of ratification by either the CHMP or the coordination group, again 30 days with no clock stop. And there's no doubt that we understand that that's going to be a challenge to the assessment teams that the PRAC are going to constitute to address these issues, and it's going to be a challenge then to the robustness of the opinion, the quality of the opinions that's delivered in that process. And that's in response to whatever sort of diverse data sources that comes in from that public call for input, and that's a challenge, and we'll just have to see how that evolves as we go forward from July next year onwards. Next slide, please. The public hearings is a may provision, so to some extent the system is not obliged to have it, and you can imagine that in various urgent situations maybe it's even not feasible to have such hearings. But at the moment, the discussions within the various groups that are considering this matter is very open as to the value, the utility, and how exactly these public hearings can be brought to bear in the context of these 107 urgent union procedures. And there's these sort of three reflections, one of which could be like the information gathering, and you could position a pre-assessment by the PRAC. So that's very much to complement, let's say, the web portal announcement to say, can you send us in data relevant to this topic? And the idea would be to also have some sort of a meeting or forum for exchange of information, even ahead of any assessment by the PRAC before they would crystallize their position. Another important feature could be that during the assessment and contributing to the opinion making, and that obviously is got an awful lot of attractions to it in terms of enriching any opinion making process. But having said that we have 60 days no clock stop, it also represents somewhat of an operational challenge to make that happen with such a compressed time frame. And then, of course, there's the third element, which is transparency at the end of the procedure to explain the recommendations. And to some extent, I think the feeling that people who are working and coming up with proposals as to how to implement the public hearing, to some extent, that could be, some people could see it, that's all there is, but I think that would be sort of selling the concept a long way short, because, simply putting that camera that we have down there in the end and being able to observe a forum of people, no matter what their constitution, is all very nice, but being able to contribute to it either in giving your own view in writing or verbal at the beginning, and they then have to look at those views, or whether then you actually engage with the process prior to any opinion, that greater degree of influence is obviously quite naturally more attractive for the individuals or groups concerned. But to be fair, nothing really has been ruled in or out. I think the impression inside with people who are actually developing these proposals at the moment, it's probably good to start with, say, the first element, which would be information gathering and a position pre-assessment as a sort of maybe early step. But there's also been, and it sort of takes me out of this 107 presentation, and I was at the earlier part of the meeting this morning, and Jutta Lindvig addressed this, that there was this idea that we have these other provisions like the 31 where the timeframes are more generous, and that potentially you could also build in a during assessment hearing in one of those procedures, and that would be also quite something that maybe we should pilot and gain some experience on 2012 and into 13. Next slide, please. The other issue is the companies, the interaction with the companies, because to some extent, having had the sort of preferential position in the old legislation, very much with the bilateral and very much confidential sort of discussions with the regulators, to some extent this 107 puts them on a similar platform, a starting point vis-a-vis the other stakeholders in the system with the public announcement for the collection of data. But there are no doubt that the legislation does talk about the possibility they can request a confidential discussion if they have matters of a confidential nature in terms of intellectual property, etc. And of course, from being authorization holders, they also have a somewhat particular status in any review procedure, and rights of legal defense during procedures, etc. Come up. There's another open topic, again, not closed out either way, which is transparency during the procedure. The feeling is that the procedure should be very open through the various milestones. And there's a lot of sort of pros and cons about this in terms of release of interim assessment reports, even requests for additional information gathering. You know, that the idea of some people are very concerned about the release of premature elements, and that people can react in a bad way to the release of these premature elements. And I think there's an awareness in the system, so long as we explain and very clearly explain the full decision-making process, the full process, then potentially release of earlier elements as a transparency measure should not jeopardize and should not have sort of these negative consequences that some people fear. Next slide, please. Another point is very detailed, really, on the rapporteur appointments, a little bit of internal kitchen cooking, but the rapporteur, co-rapporteur, so these essentially are the two lead assessors at the committee level, will be appointed by the PRAC, taking into account the various expertise in the member states, because as usual in the network, we're very dependent on the member states to give us that expertise in terms of primary assessment. And the legislation does talk about a very close collaboration. Let's imagine we're the PRAC here sitting today, CHMP are sitting upstairs, if not in the same week, but maybe next week. You guys have got to talk to the guys upstairs because you're working in a synergy to deliver an opinion, which in Europe we hope will make some sort of public health sense. So there's this exhortation to work closely with the CHMP rapporteur and the RMS reference member state. That's the guy that you'll find in maybe the CMDH or the coordination group for non-centrally authorized products. And this issue is very much in the air, certainly over the last 12 months, which is a potential requirement for independence from the primary evaluation. And this is a key issue floating around, in the sense that, let's imagine CHMP are sitting above and they license a product, and then 6 months or a year later there's an issue, a serious safety issue issued, emerging on this product, and it comes down, you're sitting here as the PRAC. If you go back to the same sort of national competent authority that delivered the primary opinion, maybe to give it to the same sort of delegation who for this safety review, maybe that's a little sort of, well, they have the experience of the product, but to some extent then they are also biased by that experience, so maybe to have a fresh pair of eyes or an independence evaluation could be very helpful. But equally, there's pros and cons regarding those models as well. That's absolutely an open discussion at the moment. Nothing definitive has come out on that. But as I say, it's a little bit internal, but there is a very important external perspective on that as well, and an overall objective there to be achieved. Next slide, please. In terms of outcome, all outcomes are possible for the PRAC. They can vary a product. They could potentially recommend it for suspension. They could recommend it for revocation or withdrawal. They could say a product shouldn't be renewed. They can oblige additional studies, and they can also oblige additional risk minimization. So they pretty much have a fairly powerful tool set in terms of an outcome as a committee. Next slide, please. In terms of how this process fits in, this is quite a detailed slide, and really the only thing to take home from it is that the model we have in Europe with these scientific committees is this monthly meeting cycle. You could do something different, 6 weeks, you could do every second month, but largely, certainly CHMP and PRAC are expected to meet on this monthly meeting cycle. And that's why an awful lot of the timelines are 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever, to sort of fit this monthly periodicity. But this new procedure is going to have to fold into this sort of monthly cycle to allow these procedures to take place in a reasonably rapid manner, and also to allow good interaction with, say, another committee structure, be it the CHMP or the coordination group, also on this monthly meeting cycle. And basically, we're going to have to build in all of these steps in the procedure described before along this wave pattern of meetings that you have. Next slide, please. In terms of a PRAC recommendation, this is already covered just verbally, but conceptually, they advise either the CHMP when a central product is there, and they deliver essentially a draft opinion to the CHMP, and the coordination group, they similarly give essentially a PRAC recommendation, which is then meant to be transformed by the coordination group or CHMP into a final opinion. The CHMP route always ends up going through the Commission with a Commission decision. The coordination group is essentially a collection of member state national agencies. If they accept the PRAC recommendation by consensus, then that's where it stops, and basically it's just a timetable to implement that action at the national level. If for some reason the member states disagree among themselves, that disagreement then is voted on and then goes straight to the Commission for a decision. And that's an important sort of evolution in the coordination group, because historically, anytime the coordination group had a divergent position, it would always go to the CHMP to then go to a binding Commission decision. But here the flow is actually quite different. It's PRAC to the coordination group. If the member states don't agree, it goes straight into a Commission decision for the binding outcome. Yeah? And then next slide, please. Important that while this procedure is going on, it's not a very long procedure. Because of the absence of clock stops overall, even with the decision phase, you might be looking at a maximum of 6 months, which in regulatory may not seem quick enough to in certain situations, but certainly in the regulatory timeframe, that's a very fast procedure. But even still, it's recognized that there are certain public health drivers where you really have got to take precautionary protective action even faster than that. And it introduces the ability to take temporary measures to be implemented immediately. And what that means is, let's imagine in a given member state they prohibited the supply of a product, they trigger an Article 107. As soon as that's triggered, the PRAC could actually say, hey guys, we think this supply should be stopped right across the community while we even do this 6-month 107 provision. So it's quite, and I think people would expect that the system has a tool in place for that. And again, we'll have to see, when these 107s are triggered, how many times temporary measures are deemed to be necessary vis-a-vis you wait for the overall procedure to close out. Next slide, please. And then Quo Vadis Article 31, Article 20, because if you go back to that little cartoon of the knife and the various toolkits there, essentially I did say that the design of the system was to essentially use 107I, the urgent union procedure, as pretty much the primary vehicle for anything that requires it, basically, irregardless, be it central. So to some extent, any pharmacovig issue that has got an urgent aspect to it ends up in the 107I, so 31 and 20, forget about it. But even if you don't have that urgency, let's imagine the system, the network system, member states, commission, whatever, say, well, there's an issue here, but we don't think it needs we don't see it as urgent, but it does need a very comprehensive risk-benefit reanalysis, whatever. It still goes to the PRAC, because we still have got constituted a committee that has got great expertise in this post-authorization risk monitoring and measurement. You still have the possibility to have a public hearing, and indeed this is the proposal that was coming from the heads of agencies, that maybe this is also a good territory to experiment with the public hearing concept and sort of gain experience with it. And a little bit of technical jargon, Article 32 procedure, what that basically means is there are rights of re-examination there which are not there in the urgent union procedure. But those elements, I think, are obviously very important changes in the system. And essentially, you got to think that you can deal with issues in a two-speed way: the urgent union 107, or maybe a more in-depth or slower procedure because of lack of urgency, essentially 31 or 20. Next slide, please. This is a bit of detail, and I really wouldn't want to spend a lot of time going into it, but it's just to emphasize the change, because before the PRAC sort of existed, in a sense, pretty much all the referrals went through the CHMP, pretty much with an outcome at the Commission decision. Yeah? But if you go back over a number of these sort of product examples that we've had, it's interesting to see which committees get involved and which don't, actually, strangely enough. And I won't go through them all, but for example, if you took something like there was an increase in mortality and risk of cancer in children concerned with the various somatropins that was initiated by France some time ago, today it was done under an Article 20, combined Article 20 and Article 107, and our feeling is that that issue would now be done under an Article 31 in the new legislation. The PRAC and the CHMP would be consulted, because indeed there are some centrally authorized products involved. Similarly, very high-profile safety issue there with the pandemrix, and was the narcolepsy in children. Reports coming out of Finland and Sweden primarily. It's in Article 20 today, 107 tomorrow, because it would be an urgent union procedure, and both the committees would be involved. Something like numesolide is an interesting one. It was an issue to do with toxicity issues, most recently identified in Ireland, led to a 107 provision, and in the new legislation would still be dealt with in a 107, but whereas in the past the CHMP has been involved in those referral procedures, in the future it will be a PRAC going to a coordination group, and no need for commission decision if the coordination group achieve that by consensus. And that's all I have to say, Chairman, on that. I think that's it's an interesting reflection in terms of a mapping exercise as to how we go from today into tomorrow, and the balance between the two committees and what goes where in the system. But the real take-home message is that the 107I, the urgent union procedure, is expected to be the largely dominant procedure for those issues that essentially fulfill the criteria. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much indeed. A detailed presentation on an important issue, and as Noel said this morning, these procedures will start as of next summer, whatever the budgetary situation, because this is about urgent protection of public health and the urgent procedure. This is definitely going to happen. So if there are procedural questions, points of principle, views on public hearings, we have a couple of minutes that we could take either questions or comments. Please go ahead.
Josie Droutwell, IPOPI. I just want to ask you a question. You just said in your last point, if there is no consensus in the coordination group, will it then go to the CHMP?
Oh, actually, that's if there's no consensus in the CMDH, they will take a vote, and then that vote goes to the Commission for a decision, and depending which way the majority goes. So that's an interesting change in a sense. Because before, CMDH pretty much have got to do everything by consensus. Yeah. If they lack the consensus, then they ended up in a formal referral procedure through the CHMP and then the decision behind. Yeah. But I think here, it's a different flow, basically.
Okay. I have a second question. Where will the public hearing be held? In the member state or?
That's a really I don't know. Well, no, I'm looking around for my colleagues in the group. Isabel's not here or whatever. But to be fair, the format, it's not really been agreed. I mean, we really haven't gone down that far. I mean, if you say where are hearings held today in the agency, it's in the agency's offices for want of anywhere else to have them. And we hear many companies, that's the routine thing, many sort of stakeholders, lobbyists, whatever. And I suppose, and we've met patient groups and all that, but logically, I suppose by extension, you would think that it would be in the agency's premises, but then you're hitting matters of capacity limitations, etc. But you could imagine that if you have a public hearing, I mean, there's all sorts of challenges, because the other issue in Europe is language as well, and that's not an easy solution, to sort of cater for the 20 plus. And it's also rather unfair just to focus in on English, because that also has a discriminatory approach. But certainly some sort of mix and match model that you might want the physical hearing, in London, but also with using the technology, the webinar-based technology, whereby questions can come in online. To some extent, some sort of mixed format that allows at least gets over a physical access, because it's easy for somebody in London to pop down here, but it's not so easy for somebody in Greece or Estonia to come across, maybe. Especially when there's no funding behind either, and you can imagine some sort of mixed format would be the way to go. There's no easy solution to the language issue. I mean, we shouldn't hide behind that. To hire translators and all that costs a vast amount of money, and in the budgetary situation, it just isn't there. But and that's why the experience is going to be fledgling, because it really is. And the advice coming from the heads of agency was, also think about it, think of the 31, whereby you might be looking at a class of products, doing a full risk benefit, and then you might be taking that whole class or one or two of those products off the market entirely. And maybe it's a good thing to have a public discussion about that and influence the pros and cons of such an action, rather than just have a very closed bilateral discussion between the industry and the regulators. But honestly, and Peter can endorse me on this one, we're sort of open to ideas, and it really is genuine in terms of how to overcome a lot of these limitations. We have the technology, and I think we'll have to use it with the webinar and when we open these things up. But there will also be a time and a physicality limitation as well, because you obviously can't just meet and talk about an issue for days either. So there will have to be some sort of mechanism whereby we limit the conduct of these hearings, as indeed we do any hearing, actually.
Yitta, I wonder if you had a view on this, because I think it was discussed at HMA on the 5th of October, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, it was discussed, and I think maybe, and I think I said this morning, and maybe I think we're not that clear on it. I think one of the views from the heads of medicines agency, at least, were that it should be justified that they add to the decisions in some way. Why should we do it? It is a lot of resources. Of course, on the other hand, there are lots of expectations, but there is also some, as Tony just said, some sort of demographic. So there is a tendency that it is in English in London, and that's not maybe what was in the vision of the legislative fathers and mothers. So it is a strong tool. It could be used very well, but we also have to make some experiments, and that is the real truth. There is not the golden standard to what, and therefore in some way we need, and if I were there, and I think we maybe should try also to stakeholders, and that could be a stay for that, couldn't we just try to take some 2 years experimental phase, because in some way there is certain anxiety that we do something, then we have it to do it forever. So in some way we need also some sort of trial period for all of us to see, because it is also for people coming to that a lot of resources. And at the end of the day, if we are just moving into some sort of ritual state-of-the-art doing, then I think it will not have the added value. We have to do something, and it could be done in many ways, and we have to do it on the right ways, and we have to evaluate afterwards. Was it worth that?
Just
a
on
quick
that,
comment, and then we.
Yeah, the one thing on that is we shouldn't underestimate the web portal announcement, which isn't the public hearing, but it's the idea of that isn't a May provision, that's systematic. And that's a hell of a change from a system that largely has been non-transparent, bilateral, sort of quasi-secret between the companies and the regulators. We're essentially saying there's a safety issue. We're putting this into the public domain, and we're saying if anybody has anything relevant to say on that matter, please send it in. That's not a May. That's a systematic provision now. And that in itself, and without a doubt, a public hearing then can be complementary to that. But that in itself is a radical change, which is systematic, and we don't know the value added, or we don't know where that'll take us, actually. Yeah?
Go ahead.
Barbara Wester on age. Of course, public hearing, you have to also realize how will it be interpreted by the public, because and will it scare people off, because you are discussing some suspected things which you then find false. I mean, it's really a tricky thing if you want the patients to go on with their medication while you investigate, because you think it may not harm them that much. So you really have to plan how to inform mass media, how to inform patient organization, who are the stakeholders here who can sort of translate the purpose of the public hearing in a way which doesn't scare people off medication unnecessarily.
I think the point's very well taken. Francois, please.
I think we welcome the idea of experimenting different formats and maybe different locations, particularly for some products who may have a national issue. Why organize the public hearings necessarily in London? People in that specific country may think, oh, they're preventing us from participating in the public discussions. And I think that's important to have in mind. I had a question regarding the time limit. So 60 days for the PRAC, 30 for the CHMP. How many for the EC?
I don't think God, I should know that answer. I think it's 67 days officially, about 2 months. Yeah. But to be fair to the European Commission, it's not all red tape and bureaucracy. I mean, that is the safeguard that the member states put in, because typically it's consultation of the standing committee, and that's where essentially the member states have the final sort of say as to anything at the European level, and there's no way that the Commission can ever bypass that. They can ask for the standing committee to do it quicker. and the most recent example of that, I suppose, has been in the pandemic, where it was done in like super quick time. Like there was all sorts of sacred cows being slaughtered, but literally to get these things done super quick. But there's no doubt that these checks and balances in the system, that's what happens at the Commission in terms of their decision making phase. But you know, the funny thing is that if there is a real safety issue, most things that are real safety issues tend to be like quality defects or something, that's going to kill you straight off. And the system is very good at sorting those out and getting those products out of the market, out of the patient's hands. When it comes to matters of risk-benefit assessment, speed isn't always of the essence, in the sense that the data can be incredibly complex, and to weigh that up can be a very complicated judgment. And if there ever was a need to, and that's where the temporary measures come in. We don't need to wait for the admin, the red tape at the end to do the final to keep all the lawyers happy. You still have the temporary measures, which is fast. You can always send out communications, dear healthcare professional letters, whatever. You can put out public statements, so you can communicate during the procedure. So there's all sorts of earlier, you know, points if the need is there. But equally, you know, to resolve something, you know, to a definitive or what's a near definitive position, that takes time. And as the colleague said, to explain that to somebody and not scare them off the medication along the way is the challenge. And that's where when I mentioned the transparency, there's a lot of people saying we will publish everything, the initial questions, the update questions, the assessment reports, all along full transparency. And a lot of people will be very happy with that. But there's other people that says, well, these are premature, these are not cooked, these are individual views, these are causing confusion and concern. That's the counter view. And the balance is not certain. I mean, to some extent, I think our understanding is the desire is to have more, you know, transparency right along the way. And so long as we explain the overall process, then hopefully we won't be scaring people off their medicines. Yeah?
Comment, Jutta?
Yes, it was just a comment to what you just said, Tony. In this web portal announcement, I think it also will be open for people who are scared of people going off medication. So information about, please be aware that there is this patient group also in the evaluation. So it's only not just providing, so to say, safety risk, but also positive data. So that is very important to underline, that it's all sorts of data, and also be aware maybe there are a special group which could be really left alone if you do something you don't reflect very much.
Other comments, questions relating to the urgent union procedure public hearings, please.
Fiona Riki, Janssen R&D and EPIA. Just a clarification question on the decision making and the CMDH and consensus. Will that just be consensus of members present?
It's indeed it's quorum. They'll have quorum rules and probably majority rules as well. I can imagine, because they have a different constitution vis-a-vis the scientific committees, you can have delegation, basically. You can have proxy votes as well on that. So I imagine in that sense the representativeness would be very important. But I mean, your point is taken. I mean, before, to some extent, the CMDH is a very useful body, no doubt about that, in facilitating 95% of the system, but they didn't have a lot of binding votes, in a sense. It was consensus, or else then it went into a formal referral. Now the legislation empowers the coordination group, and that in itself is good because it's a streamlining sort of thing. But then the representativity of the member states, then it's important that if they're not going to be there, that they've delegated it for a given vote. But the expectation is it's normally a very well supported. The heads of agency recognise it as a very important body, and it's typically very well represented. Yeah.